Good afternoon. I'm Richard Abermanco, Professor of Political Science and Integrated Liberal Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This is the 12th installment, I believe, of our lecture series on conservative political thought. And today I am delighted to welcome Dr. Joshua Mitchell to Madison. Dr. Mitchell is Professor of Political Science at Georgetown University, where he was the chairman of the department, which I understand was a great job. He was also a member of the startup team for Georgetown University School of Foreign Service when they created a campus in Doha, Qatar in 2005. From 2008 to 2010, Dr. Mitchell took leave from Georgetown University, where he was the acting chancellor of the American University of Iraq in Suleimani, Iraq. If you're coming for dinner tonight, he has some pretty interesting stories about the time in Iraq. His research interests lie in the relationship between political thought and theology in the West. He's published articles in the Review of Politics, the Journal of Politics, the Journal of Religion, American Political Science Review, Political Theory, and he is the author of Not by Reason Alone, Religion, History, and Identity in Early Modern Political Thought, and The Fragility of Freedom, Tocqueville on Religion, Democracy, and American Future, both of which were published by the University of Chicago Press. His book, Plato's Fable on the Mortal Condition in Shadowy Times, was published by Princeton University Press. And my favorite of his books, which I strongly recommend you read, is called Tocqueville in Arabia, Dilemmas of the Democratic Age, which was published by the University of Chicago. His most recent book, American Awakening, Identity Politics, and Other Afflictions of Our Time, was published in 2020 by Encounter Books. And he's currently working on a new book, which I am greatly looking forward to, called The Gentle Seduction of Tyranny. In addition to teaching at Georgetown University, Dr. Mitchell is an avid conservationist, working to restore a farmhouse on the Eastern Shore in the state of Maryland, and working to develop and patent, if I understand correctly, the next generation of solar electric sailboats. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Mitchell to Madison.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll talk about conservative thought, and I'm happy to develop a number of issues right from the outset. First, I've been in this business a long time, since, say, really the early 80s. And the way the left-right configuration has been set up is, on the one hand, you've got those on the right who want to talk about human nature, something fixed. On the left, largely a kind of historical view according to which everything is contingent, negotiable, etc. And it looks to me like we're not going to get very far with those kinds of distinctions. I've been involved in these debates for many, many years. The country is more polarized than ever. It's not clear to me that anyone has the upper hand intellectually, but nevertheless, that debate carries on. And I will say, whatever Trump. What happened was the old conservative consensus was absolutely blown up. It was bound to be blown up anyway, but it's just not clear what a conservative is. There's a whole range of people. Actually, you're having Patrick, who's a colleague of mine at Georgetown. Is Patrick a conservative, post-liberal? But it's just not clear to me what these terms mean right now. You still have the free market types. They're alive and well. Consider market efficiency to be the criteria of social order. Began really with the Reagan years, administratively. And then you have this other group of conservatives who are thinking about the debt that we owe to our fathers, and we use that formulation throughout here. The traditionalists who think that we have to, in some measure, recapitulate, reproduce the inheritance that we had received. That's a deep conservative impulse. And for the moment, I'll come to this a little bit later on. For the moment, thanks really to the group that you may have heard of called the NatCon movement. So how many of you have heard of that? NatCon, National Conservative Movement. It's an important group. It's more of a convening group. I think what's happened now within the conservative movement is you do have a shift. There's no longer, to use Ramazzoни's words, there's no longer what he calls the free market movement, because throughout the 1980s, traditional conservatives who are thinking in terms of the importance that Tocquevillian concerns. I am a Tocqueville. The Tocquevillian concerns about mediating institutions, family, local life, churches, etc. that group largely capitulated to the free market types because as a lot of traditional conservatives would say, you have universal free markets and you're going to destroy the middle class, you're going to destroy the mediating institutions. That group is largely silent up until Trump will. And now I think they're in ascendancy. And for some people, that's a cause for celebration. One of the things I'm going to try and talk to you about today is whether that's enough. Remember, what I'm trying to talk to you about is what I think to be the failure of conservatism to understand, let alone address, identity politics. So when we get to that, to put the matter in most blunt of terms, it seems to me that going forward, we have two choices, and this will make sense a little bit later on. It's either reconciliation or retribution. There's so much pent up anger, hostility, and impugning of groups, shame about past events, that, and an inability to discharge the debt. An ability to discharge the debt. That our politics now is reaching a point where we're proceeding administratively, but politically we're absolutely frozen. Now, I want to put this in a Tocquevillian framework, and by this, Tocqueville, forget the conservative tropes, free market traditions. I do think Tocqueville's Democracy is the book from the 19th century, which has echoes in the 20th century, from Nisbet, Bella, and any number of other authors that you probably read. I think it's the book that has, I shudder to use the word blueprint, but a general theory of social order on the basis of which democracy can be redeemed. So now, what he understood was there's two possibilities. We're either going to have equality in servitude or equality. So what Tocqueville points out is the mechanisms necessary to have an equality in living. And these include, as you probably know, mediating institutions. Something must stand between the one and the many. Lonely, isolated citizens, I'll talk about loneliness and depression in a bit. Lonely, isolated citizens in the ever-growing power of the state. So Tocqueville thought that the only way forward was if we had robust mediating institutions. And from, did you all read sections from Nisbet or somebody talked about Nisbet, Professor Community? So right after World War II, Robert Nisbet writes this really extraordinary book. It's a profoundly moving book. It's a Professor Community. And really from there, all the way through Robert Bella, Habits of the Heart, in the late 80s, to Robert Putnam making democracy work after the fall. There's an understanding, which I think is still alive, that all of our mediating institutions are incredibly fragile. They're falling apart. Our families aren't quite working, no matter how much we try to configure them or reconfigure them. People are losing the ability to form face-to-face, spontaneous associations, which is why almost all of us now will text message before we call. How many will text message before you call someone? Who does not do that? Who spontaneously? Rare.
Myers. Luddites.
Yeah, well, continue on that. So Tocqueville saw the problem in 1835, 1840. This is volume 1, volume 2, America. And then after World War II, you have a whole host of really fine social thinkers who see that we have the atrophy of these mediating institutions. So the first threat to these mediating institutions is atrophy. It's just hard to have a family. It's hard to have face-to-face associations. Mm-hmm. It's hard to make religious associations work. It's incredibly difficult. It's not clear that there can ever be a how-to manual, how to be a good friend, how to be a good wife. It's just not very hard to do. But what I want to suggest to you is that there's actually two other threats to these mediating institutions. And the second one is identity politics. And the brief account of this is that what identity politics is in the business of doing is establishing who is pure and who is. These categories of purity and stain are theological categories. So I'm a political theorist, but I have my work at the University of Chicago Divinity School, so I'm very tuned in to religious categories. I think part of the reason why conservatives don't get it is they don't understand that this is a kind of religious movement, which will come to. So why is identity politics a threat? Because what it does is identity politics is in the business of finding stain. And if you look at any system, any nation system, you will find all sorts of things which you should be ashamed of. But the problem is the criteria of identity politics requires that if there's any stain, it has to be found out. And so we can argue, I think, in responsible ways about which statues should stand and which statues should not stand. But I think if you're operating from within the paradigm of identity politics, you would say that if there's any impurity, that say founding father has to be. So if Washington or Jefferson owned slaves, well, this is the general frame of mind of identity politics, which is we're looking for purity. So you can see how identity politics saw, for example, the traditional family as being possessing the stain of, let's use the phrase, patriarchy. Well, then you can see how then that community institution has to be right. And that's the second threat I would be. First problem that we're facing is there's a general atrophy in associational life. And the second one is that identity politics goes after these mediating institutions. The third problem, which I won't talk about today, but I'm happy to after formal remarks, what I call substitutism. And it's an awkward phrase, and I don't really know how to describe it other than that. But it's an ancient idea. It's in the history. It's in Plato's Republic. Very much in Rousseau. And the idea is the following. Well, actually, I'll do this way. How many of you seriously into physical fitness and have taken supplements like protein powders? Okay, great. Okay, great. And how many of you have been tempted to do this in the midst of your workouts to say, well, making a meal is really kind of takes a long time. Why don't I just try living on these supplements? Anybody? Nobody? Nobody's been tempted by turning the supplement into a substitute. So meal, vitamin, there's a supplement that you can take to enhance your strength, but it can't be a substitute for the meal itself. That's the general formula, but let me now do this in terms of something. Let's talk about the competence of friendship. That's the meal. It's there's a recipe for it. But what happened 15, 20 years ago, and you're living with further iterations of it, was Facebook came along and gave us this category called Facebook Friends. It's a very interesting idea. Or here's another one. You ready? Online shopping. These two terms suppose they suppose that there's a competence. First case, friendship, and the second case, shopping, kind of connoisseurship, kind of art, which can be moved online, and your powers can be expanded. And you know this because you have a conversation with your mother or your father. That's great, but you can actually be far away and have a Zoom conversation with them, and that enhances the strength that you already have, the knowledge that you already have, actions you already have. But here's the problem. It's one thing to use this social media. I'll now move from Facebook to social media. To use it as a supplement to friendship and the rich network of associations you have. And it's another thing to use it as a substitute for. It strikes me that what we're doing is similar to what weightlifters do, and what we're all tempted to do because we are human beings who are always looking for shortcuts. Always looking for shortcuts. I'm not going to read Plato, we read Spartan's version of it. We're always looking for shortcuts. And I think what Tocqueville saw was that life is really hard. And if we're going to build out these robust network of associations, we can have supplements to them, but we can't have substitutes for them. The way this shows up in Tocqueville is, and you can think about this in terms of race relations later on if you want. The state can be a supplement to our mediating institutions, but cannot be a substitute for our institutions. The way this showed up in the case of the civil rights movement in the 1960s was there was clear awareness that there were problems in racial relations in America. And I think largely based on goodwill, the state steps in and displaces this huge network of informal affiliations within Black America, becomes a substitute for them. And Black conservatives like Bob Woodson, who I worked with, and any number of others today will point out that in this very Tocqueville light, that the state can supplement the institutions, they cannot be a substitute for them. So you see this in terms of the last 50 or 60 years, but you see this everywhere. We're all looking to turn supplements into substitutes. That to me is the third threat to these mediating institutions. That would be there's lectures, but I'm simply going to identify them right now for you. I want to talk mostly about the second threat, which is identity politics. Now, I think we step back and ask is, do we live in a secular age? Well, I grew up in Ann Arbor, went to the University of Michigan, deeply committed to the sciences and engineering, still am. I probably read more science than I do anything else these days. But do we live in a secular age? And Tocqueville, not in Democracy in America, but in the second book, years before he died, came up with this term. He said the French Revolution is an incomplete. Now, what did he mean? What he saw was that the French Revolution had aspirations that were really thin Christian, like the Universal Brotherhood of Saints, so became translated as the Universal Brotherhood. And the idea that we can move beyond the embodied particularist forms, which I think has its equivalent as the beyond the generative body to the immortal body at the end of time. Anyway, what Tocqueville saw very clearly was that as Christianity faltered, we were not going to move into a secular age. We were going to move into an age. This could go on for a very, very long time, hundreds and hundreds of years. And what I'd like to propose here is that, in point of fact, we are now living in the third wave of incomplete. The second one, the second one was Marxism. Because there too, you have an attempt to redeem the world, redemption of the world, and also, and I'll say a great deal more about this. You have the category of the innocent. You look at the opening paragraph of the innocent victim. Okay? If you look at the opening paragraph of the Communist Manifesto, it's there, it's screaming at you, and we just read it and we don't see it. The world is divided between the oppressor and the oppressed. The innocent victim and the transgressor. And with identity politics, as I've said to you before, have the third being completed, which is now because the category of the innocent victim is central. Something you all ought to know and think deeply about for the rest of your life is, where does the category of the innocent victim come? In the ancient days, you had sacrifice and victims. Innocent victims. That's, those of you who read anything about Nietzsche know that his contempt for Christianity very much comes out of this claim that the category of the innocent victim is central to Christianity. And Nietzsche, of course, thinks this is the worst thing that could possibly happen, because what this does is it inverts the natural order. And the natural order is this: strength is strength and weakness is weakness. And what Christianity does is it inverts this. It says no, weakness is strength. So St. Paul's power made perfect in weakness. Christ, the innocent victim on the cross. So Nietzsche in the 1890s, right, 50 years after Tocqueville, sees this what he thinks is a problem, which is that the category of the innocent victim, the central category of Christianity, has now so deepened human life that we are now frightened to cause the least harm to anyone. So he, in a way, anticipates identity politics. I'll say more about this. But what I'm trying to get you to think about here is Might it be the case that we don't live in the second state? In point of fact, we are now living out in the third way of this strange set of incomplete religions which draw on Christian categories, but also repudiate Christian. So the French Revolution had components opposed to the Roman Catholic Church. Marxism very clearly opposed to Christianity. Identity politics, in many of its iterations, opposed to Christianity. But we have to be very clear, just because it's opposed to, it can be opposed to in a number of ways. It can be a Christian heresy, it can be a Christian apostasy. So you can still have these religious movements which are opposed to Christianity, which claim to be not Christian. But in point of fact, to follow both Tocqueville and Nietzsche, say about Nietzsche's reading of this in a while. In point of fact, what happens is they're taking fragments of Christianity, building a conceptual whole out of it, deeply distorting Christianity. But, and here I'll say it, but providing human beings with what they essentially need. And what they have essentially always needed is a way of distinguishing between purity and stain. The word pollution, long before it's used in environmental science, is a religious term. You have to be very clear about this. Nietzsche saw this, by the way, in the first essay that you acknowledged. The term pollution is a theological word. And you might want to think, here, me, the guy committed to solar electric examples, you might want to think, because I think this technology is spectacular, but I'm not a religious zealot about it, meaning I'm not prepared to use the language of purity and stain, dirty fossil fuels, clean energy. These are theological terms. And I'll come to my larger claim, which is we are now living in this profound religious moment where everybody is searching to figure out who is pure and who is stained. We're living in another great awakening. Now, I want to say something more about the Tocqueville problem. We'll start with Tocqueville and then move out from there. I think what Tocqueville saw is that we're living in a very split world. Living in a split world so that there's an unbridgeable chasm between left and right. We're living in a split world socially, and that so many of us now are without our mediating institutions, and so our alliances or our allegiances. You tell me how this works for you. Our allegiances move back and forth between simply our own self-expression and a kind of universal commitment to humanity as a whole, but nothing in between. Are you committed to your own town, or is it just universal humanity that you're part of? So sociologically, things are splitting. Economically, things are splitting apart. Slowly but surely moving. And then psychologically, I think the big ripping part of this is a parallel to the claim about sociological division. So you tell me if you experience this, right? Tocqueville says, near the end of volume 2, I foresee a time when citizens will think of themselves as greater than kings and less than men. He's describing a psychological condition in which you and I oscillate back and forth between feeling ourselves to be utterly self-sufficient, and I characterize this phenomena as selfie man, as we have our own little pages and curate and demonstrate who we are in all of our grandness, which is why I don't send out Christmas cards. I'm sick and tired of receiving these Christmas cards where the perfect family and their perfect kids are doing everything perfect. I'm not going to do this because I know that human life is way too broken for that to be true for most of us. So on the one hand, greater than kings and less than men. You can say or. He said and what he's describing is what he saw to be the democratic psychological condition near the end of the democratic age. He does say, by the way, that madness will become a condition of democratic age, much more so. He means by this. I'll translate for you. Long before the words bipolar and manic depression, Tocqueville saw a problem which he took to be not a medical problem in the brain. He thought that as we moved into the democratic age, where we would break the ties that connect us, happen is that you and I will become more and more untethered. We will oscillate back and forth between thinking of ourselves as kind of hovering over the world in greatness, the romantic, and utterly. So we would bounce back and forth between thinking of ourselves as greater than kings and less than. I'm not going to ask for the survey, but I know that it's not just the younger generation. I know this is a predominant psychological issue in the Democratic, which has for Tocqueville, has no medical treatment. Because the only way we can fix this is to fill out again the mediating institutions which stand between the state and you and I and our lonely isolation. Can only be ameliorated, I can say cured, made less bad by never-ending engagement on face-to-face relations, which is why the most important thing you can probably do, whether you're a conservative or on the left, if you really want to follow Tocqueville, would be to cancel this evening all of your social media. Everyone. I say this to my Georgetown students. I say, you're addicted. They say, yep, that's right. I say, you need to stop. I say, no, I'm good. So you all need to think about this. This is not just abstract ideas. This is how we're living right now. You predicted the psychological bifurcation. Again, what I was trying to say is that we have to find a way of not oscillating, rebuild the class. We have to find a political way forward that's neither quite far right nor left. If you look at the last sentence in the author's introduction, he says, while the parties have busied themselves with tomorrow, I am trying to see the whole future. While the left and the right are doing this, I'm trying to see this. That's democracy in America. Okay. And I'm not sure if that's quite conservative or quite liberal. That book, which is to say, I'm not sure where I am on this either. That book is in many ways conservative, but he understands that this thing called equality is moving forward, as the left is saying. He's trying to find that thin middle ground between these two positions. So he's always trying to find a middle. He's a theorist of mediation. So it's against that larger backdrop that I think we have to think about where we are and how we should go forward thinking about problems. Let's say again, my general thesis is, yes, there's aspects of what we could call a secular science and engineering stuff I read about. But on the other hand, along with this seeming pure secular, we are involved in one wave of incomplete religion after another. I'm suggesting by them. What I want to do in a little bit, say more about that. But first, I want to talk about what I'm supposed to be talking about here, which is the impotence on the right, but I want to say some things about the left too. So I've given, I don't know, 50 talks about my work on identity politics to conservative audiences, and I will say I don't think everyone. I'll tell you why, because generally speaking, conservatives don't grasp what's going on in this new movement from the left. And the way I want to present this is the following. I want to suggest to you, we think about the problem or think about our world in terms of three schemes of debt. And if you think debt is not important, you might want to look at the opening scene of Platon's Republic, where the first, remember in book 1 of the Republic, there's 3 definitions of justice. One by Son, and then the third by Thrasymachus. And the first one, which I don't think is an accident, is the first one is offered by Epictetus. Justice is debt. Justice, you have to pay back over it. I think Plato puts that in because it's probably the deepest psychological teaching of what human life is all about. Payment of debts. One of the oldest texts we have is the Code of Hammurabi. It's a list of equivalences. This gets this punishment, etc. So one of the deepest things that's in us is that, another way to put this is, you owe me, I owe you. This is what we're fixed on. And in the conservative movement, you have 2. And I named them, but I didn't describe them as schemes of debt. I talked about free market people, free market conservatives, and tradition. You can look at these as schemes of debt. What do the free markets people understand? There's a world of pain, commerce matters. price theory of change, or the price, using the price indicator is the best way to proceed with healthy change within a society, healthy growth, or to use Adam Smith's words, improve. It's a wonderful word. It's the central word in Adam Smith's publications. But it's a scheme of payments, scheme of debt. And free market conservatives understand that economy of debt. It's money. And I would say that much of the Reagan legacy, the Reagan intellectual impetus was based on this idea that we don't have to think in terms of other definitions of efficiency or goodness. So let's use the market system to establish where resources should go. And so if you're stealing, breaks down stuff. That was the argument. So free market conservatives understand debt as payment. The second group of conservatives, traditionalists, understand, like, back to the phrase I gave you a few minutes ago, that we owe our fathers. And I mean this, founding fathers, or, excuse me, mothers and fathers. Second, and I think there's been an interesting but unstable balance in the conservative movement up to the Trump times, where the economic conservatives had the upper hand, but still there was this understanding the debt we owe our fathers, what we've inherited in the way of our religion, our understanding of norms, our understanding what the family is. We have a debt to them to carry this. So Burke would talk about multi-generational contract between the living. This is the basis of the second understanding. It's not free market debt. It's the debt that the generations of the two debt load. And as I said to you before, with the NatCon movement, your Amazzoni, there's been a rebalancing. And now the cultural conservatives believe in the tradition, the debts we owe our fathers. They have a slightly upper hand now in the debates within the conservative. J.B. Vance, among others, and whatever you think of him, the most important thing is that the old hegemony of free market conservatives is over. And Patrick, who's coming next week, is part of this new wave of people who are saying free markets are not the only thing. Look, you might not think this is radical. This is breaking a 40-year headlock that certain kind of conservatives had within the conservative. Okay, that's great. So there's a rebalancing, let us say, and a lot of these NatCon types, and I'm not going to name names, but others on the right who now feel liberated from called economic conservatives. They think, great, we're going to do this, and we're going to go forward. And my argument is which I'm going to call spiritual debt. So economic debt, eternal debt, identity politics is based on spiritual. It's an unpayable spiritual debt. And if you wonder whether in fact there is this other kind of economy, spiritual economy, right to the New Testament. I'm sure it's there in the Old Testament. I'll give you some passages from the New Testament, right? The story of Judas. Who's Judas? He was the treasurer. He was the one responsible for collecting money to advance Christ's mission. What was Judas expecting? Judas wanted a social revolution. He wanted the money to be distributed. He wanted social justice, which is very clear. He was a social justice. That was Judas. And he betrays Christ. To be really clear about this, he betrays Christ because Christ takes the oil, 50 whatever the shekels. It could have gone to the revolution, and it gets poured out on him. And Christ says, "The poor will be with us." Judas feels betrayed, but Christ is saying, "There's another economy. I'm here to give you." No, Christ. I am here to give you a gift that's beyond price, and Judas can't accept that. Another great example, which we can't even read because we can't even see the whole New Testament is about this other economy. The opening passages to Luke chapter 2. It's this: all the world was to be taxed. You think, well, what's that all about? Baby in a manger. What's going on there? Well, okay, let's think about this in terms of the 21st century, the great digital tech dream. That the Silicon Valley titans can render everything as a digital bit, and everything becomes something. Everything becomes a bill. You can extract rent from everything by rendering everything as digital. That is the equivalent of all the world to be taxed, meaning that everything could be rendered in terms of payment. Everything. And then the narrator gives you Jesus in a manger, not in the inn, which could have been taxed. He's outside of the material economy. One other quick example. Let's go on and on and on. Do you know about the story of Barabbas? So Christ is to be, Christ may be crucified. Who do you want? He says to the crowd. Who do you want? Do you want Barabbas or Christ? Well, do you know what the name Barabbas means? Barabbas, son of the Father. There are two sons of the Father there. Christ, son of the Father, Barabbas, who's, by the way, a social revolutionary, who was put in jail for trying to start a social revolution. And what's made very clear is that the crowd makes a mistake. They think that the way forward is through a kind of social revolution, but there's another economy of redemption that has nothing to do with social justice. That's that too. So look, let's go on and on. I don't want to give you a lecture on theology. What I want to give you a lecture on is why it is conservatives don't grasp what's going on. Identity politics. And the answer is that the conservative movement understands the first two kinds of debt, economic debt, debt of fathers, but not this deeper spiritual economy. And here I give credit to the left because I think it is the central problem, which is kind of spiritual debt. We all know we're part of spiritual economy. And we don't quite know how to negotiate that spiritual economy. And that is, I think, what the left is fixing, this new spiritual economy. I just want to make mention in passing that the whole thing, full of identity politics, holds together only on the assumption that groups are Unitarians. So that white is one, black is one, gay is one, black is one. Part of the reason I'm going to raise this right now is because you therefore have to be a certain sort if you're going to count in that. So Richard Bob Woodson, Ben Lowry, or anyone for Black conservatives who are literally just because if you're going to be black, you have to, Joe Biden, you ain't black if you're, but you have to be clear that identity politics really must suppose that groups are unitary entities. And so under the name of bringing in diversity and inclusion, it actually literally divides communities right into. So Black conservatives count, women don't count, Black women. Joe Biden sings the praises of a Black woman on the Supreme Court, but what he doesn't tell you was back in the 1980s, Supreme Court, remember this California Supreme Court, Janice Rogers Brown, brilliant. You should go look at her speech to the Federalist Society. Black. He made it impossible for he blocked her from becoming the first one on the Supreme Court because she was conservative. Anyway, to be a member, to be part of identity politics, we have to make groups mono. This is one of the great Achilles heel of this. But now I need to ask the question: so why has this? Or give me a call on time. It's up 20 minutes. So why has this taken control? Why does it consume all of you all? To some extent, me, but less. I'm not sure why, because I don't have. I can lose my position very easily. But I think we have to look at the. I'll give you two horizons. I'll give you a post-World War II horizon, and then I'm going to give you late 19th century. What I'm trying to account of is how it is we've gotten to the point. The problem of spiritual debt is so grave that conservatives can't even answer. cannot answer. So first I'll talk about what happened after World War II in America and in Europe. But also we talked about the Great Wound, which is like, and one of the problems with conservatives, in my view, when I talk about race in a room full of conservatives, their job is catastrophic. I'm happy to talk with you about how we might think constructively about race after this. But the televising of the hosing down of young Black children in the South in the 1960s, oh, so many. And what it made clear was that the racial slavery had not yet. So there was a need for Christian categories, atonement. But precisely at that moment in America, the churches got weak. And I mean both Protestant and Catholic. And I will say Reformed Jews. They're all weak. And now let's go to Europe. America has the problem of slavery, legacy of slavery. Europe has, here, let's list it. Their churches. Now, the whole of human history, the whole of Christian history in the West, the history of Christendom is the history of barbarism and the beginnings of atonement. I tell my students this Rousseauian delusion about the natural goodness of man must go. Racism, all hatreds, this is the norm. The question you should ask is, what are we to? The norm is not we all feel good about each other, and then there are those bad people who quite the opposite. And the point was that the history of America in all times, history of every nation in all times is history. That's not the trouble. Of course, the trouble is, how then do you move forward? How do you have it tomorrow if there's been violence? And one of the things Nietzsche saw was that as Christianity was being fought, the West could no longer answer the question, how could you have it tomorrow? Because the mechanism within Christendom to have it tomorrow is like 8 words: atonement, repentance, forgiveness. And the structure of the cosmos Christianly understood is man born in goodness, turned toward darkness, never-ending violence, starting with the first family where the brother makes the brother. Never-ending violence, never-ending errancy. And yet God's mercy, always bringing us back on track, just enough to go forward in part of his grander creation. None of that makes sense. All we can feel in the West, and here I mean America with its slavery, and Europe with its spiritual legacies, is guilt. Never. And in my view, that is the central problem. But Nietzsche saw, not a Nietzschean, but I think his diagnosis in some ways was very apt. He saw what I call the great exhaustion of the West, meaning that people would become so overwhelmed with the burdens, with the histories that continually get brought up and saying, see, you did this, see, you did this, see, you did this. That people just give up on trying to do anything. That's the crisis. So precisely at the moment when the spiritual resources to address this eternal problem of man's turn to darkness, precisely at the moment when those resources begin to dissipate, the historical legacy of the atrocities, to slavery and its aftermath in Jim Crow, all this comes forward. And there's addressing this. And the brief account of this is that at one point, the churches understood, and here I'll sound like Burke for a minute, understood the excellence of composition. I mean, two things which don't quite go together do go together and must go together. What are the two things that do go together and must go together? And sin and God's grace, God's love, and God's judgment. Judgment against our sin. And what happened was, because we're all democratic souls and unable to hold two things that are difficult together as they're supposed to be, choose one. And what happened was all the churches, and you see this everywhere, God's love about judgment. We must, as I said to you before, which is why Cephalus is the first person in the Republic, we must, you and I, figure out how to think through that. And I don't mean just the money we owe. We have some sense that there's a deeper spiritual depth within us that has to be addressed. Precisely at the moment when the churches went soft and chose only the God of love, I'm not saying it should be just the God of judgment, it has to be both together. When the churches went soft, then people had to look for a way to think through transgression and stain, and the churches could no longer do it. Because the churches believed in universal love and universal sympathy. But you and I know that there's something going on here, some kind of debt that has to be discharged. There's no longer a theological way of discharge. And that is what happened with identity politics. Some of you know about, so identity politics becomes the mechanism, the political mechanism, for thinking through stain and transgression. And the churches don't want it. Some of you have heard of the Pew Trust poll, which indicates that some 40% of Americans are nuns and NES. They have no religious affiliation. You heard about this? And so people are screaming, "Oh my goodness, we're not Christian. The country's not Christian anymore." Conservatives scream. So you really understand. Ask the wrong question. Because America is still the most religious country in the world. In that, desperately trying to think, I don't mean we're church going. I don't mean that at all. Because we have a new church. People say, well, there's, the NatCons want to have Christian nationalism. And my argument is we have an established church right now. It's identity politics. It's the established church. So the nuns, young people today, not only young people, they're not going to church because they're not finding a way to think through purity and stain in the moral economy of the churches because it's all God is love. And that might be comforting to some extent. But then why has identity politics ripped through America, taken over every institution? My answer is human beings, especially Americans, just passing looking for the way to think and stay. And they're finding with identity politics. I think it's ultimately not enough, but they're finding. Now let's talk about the larger before, not just looking at the 20th century, half the 20th century on. That's teaches. I recommend you read portions of the genealogy of morals and other things too, but I think the first essay, the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche pretty much teases out what's the crisis? Why is Europe? His answer is Europe claimed, as you and I do, that we're now second. But what Nietzsche said was, they're not. In a famous phrase, which Rick has heard me repeat 500 times the last 2 years. It's the church and not its poison that offends us. And what he means is us Europeans or us secularists. It's the church and not its poison that offends us. So you and I, proud that we're secularists, we look down our nose at those people. But he says, we still accept the poison of the church. What does he mean by that? He meant the categories of the church, the moral categories, like equality, dignity of persons, and I'll add, like the category of these. Right. So what's happened, to come back to Tocqueville's is that here Tocqueville and Nietzsche are aligned, though you have to do a bit of the language translation, is that after the French Revolution, we don't get secularism. The story we tell is once there was the era of Christendom, and we no longer call the West Christendom, we call it the West because we've gone secular. And what I'm trying to say is that the two greatest minds of the 19th century understood that it wasn't quite that simple. And in point of fact, what would happen as we entered the so-called post-Christian era is it wouldn't be post-Christian. It would be post-comprehensively Christian. What would happen hundreds of years, we would go from one religion to another, that's the Tocqueville's language. One invocation of Christianity's poison after another. None of them fully Christian. None of them post-Christian. And to be post-Christian, truly post-Christian gang, you would have to eliminate the category. So Nietzsche would quite clearly predict that identity politics would follow in the wake of the seeming death of Christianity. So Nietzsche and Tocqueville each saw that after Christianity does not come a secular age, what comes after that is this age that's partially Christian, certainly anti-Christian. So I'm not sure if I should call identity politics a heresy or apostasy. But we're not living in a world that's purely secular, and identity politics proves this because we're all desperately trying to fix that thing. So to come back to the Pew poll on the churches are, because young people have a way of thinking through things. It's called identity. There's a whole intersectional scorecard that tells you what your ranking is and what you must do not to be identified among the impure. So again, I want to credit the left. Because what the left gets, conservatives don't get, is that there's a different economy. It's a really, really important economy, which is why it allows you to make sense of how the left can say, well, even if it costs $50 trillion to go green, even if it costs way more money than we even have, we must do it. Why? Because what they understand is the spiritual economy is the deepest economy. More important than the economy that we see that the economists recognize. So I want you to think about this long and hard. Are we engaged are we involved in a spiritual moment in which purity stands simple issues are less than enough? What I see at Georgetown, I suspect that it's true here, true elsewhere, but what I see at Georgetown is students daily performing a Passover, the Jewish Passover. We're daily Jews. Now, people use throughout the term recklessly the term virtues. Virtue is a Greek virtue. What I'm suggesting is this has nothing to do with virtues. This is innocence. Sacred. Innocence is a Hebrew biblical. And so the Passover ritual, something might recall, is one which the Jews must undertake in the Egyptian captivity. And in order for death to pass the mob, they must paint the blood of an innocent lamb on the lintel. What I'm suggesting is that instead of doing the necessary work of building the tree, what most of America is doing on a daily basis is involving themselves in a Passover ritual where they paint the blood of innocents, or whether it's performative justice, like posting I stand with Ukraine or whatever else. In social media. That's the blood of innocence that you paint so that social death and cancellation will pass you by. Now, do not misunderstand me. There are real problems to be solved. What I'm suggesting is that identity politics, which ostensibly points to those problems, most notably, is the worst possible that you can use. That you need to get past the language of patent. You need to put the language of innocence and transgression back into the theological frame where it belongs, so that we can build this Tocquevillian world of what I call competence. Politics, competence. You call it merit. I don't like that term because it's so loaded. The question is whether we are going to look at each other as competent as possible, competent fellow citizens building the world together. That would be the basis of our family. Or whether we are going to look at each other as we would if we're practicing the Passover ritual, who among us is the most pure? And do not really care a job about solving so performative justice, claiming that I'm guilty of white privilege and that absolves me. Or I paint a Black Lives Matter sign down my main street in the this to me is a catastrophe because it does not address the root, and it allows us to get a moral pass. And so I think, I'll end with this, but it's a whole subject. It's not by accident. It's the largest companies in the world. Because if you were to look at them through the lens of the average everyday economy, what the economy is supposed to be, you would say that monopoly capitalism is very bad. You never want to have a company. But if you are one of these corporations and say, here's how I've painted the blood of innocence so that I have social death will not get me. I'm for diversity, equity, inclusion, and you get a pass. And then you can keep getting more and more money and they have the right spiritual. even if they are maybe they're gutting the middle class, not the capitalism. This is a very, very serious problem. It has blinded us. Real problems. There are real problems. So our choice going forward is either what I call the politics of competence, which is what Tocqueville, building up the competences in everyday life in these medium friendships, or the politics of innocence and transgression. The only thing is our innocent victim. It's or and whether we have done enough to paint the blood of innocence. That's
the clarify your living beyond less than. Well, that okay,
greater than kings and less than.
okay, yeah, so for greater than kings, I guess in like modern, it's that like, especially related to like social media, it's like unnatural amount of support for your life as a whole, your likes, follows, and more. Would that be like?
Yeah, and the ability to silence and to get rid of those who might raise some objections. This is what I call selfie man. We've all become selfie. And it's the great pathology I think Tocqueville saw long before the internet was even. This is a characteristic of isolationist technology.
And less than men, without our social media, if you're not, we've eliminated all of the art.
Well, I would say without, well, so I would put it in a different way. You know, what you're saying might be on the mark as well, but so what Tocqueville worried about is the thing that I see, which is, I'm not going to impugn myself. I need to say something in general. But I saw sentiments, which was young people feeling very empowered by their social media. And you would ask them, so are you going to vote? Or let's do climate change. And again, you know, my credentials should suggest something about outlining sort of these things. So when the US, well, through Trump, pulled out of the climate change agreements, everybody said, well, that's the end. Well, but you have to understand the implications of this. The only way anything can is global. That every problem is now global, which is what you have been taught. Which Tocqueville would say, you will never solve a problem. You live in nations that's the highest unit you will ever have. You can have transnational agreements. You will never have universal government. You'll never have cosmopolitan man. We are by because we are embodied creatures. And the question for him is how it is we can have, to use his language, because the contemporary language is so corrupted, we can have well-considered patriotism. You have to love our country, but you can't love your country as some enchant, having somebody enchant that. You only feel a love of the highest unit you can have through your involvement. So you can love your country once you realize that it's been set up so that some people stay in local life. You can have these mediating institutions and develop competencies, and therefore be thankful that you have the opportunity in this domain where you've got federalism, et cetera, to thrive as a human being. You have to start from local. So Tocqueville's biggest worry was disembodied. This is, by the way, romanticism. What's romanticism? Well, hover over every detail of life and say, well, if I choose that, it'll be limiting in this way. If I choose that, it'll be limiting in this way. This is the great temptation. Not by accident does romanticism emerge as the democratic age begins to flower, because you have persons more and more disconnected. They begin to hover over the world and imagine themselves as being cosmopolitan citizens. I don't have a country anymore. I'm just a member of humanity. I believe in universal human rights, and meanwhile there's something else. You can't see it because the only thing you're looking for is the universal. So Tocqueville saw this in the aftermath of the French Revolution. The whole of democracy in America is written in the shadow of the French Revolution, meaning it's written with an understanding that once all the links are broken, which is the characteristic of the democratic age, the disposition of all of us is to fly off into abstract universalism, talking about that, and to feel yourself on the one hand greater than kings and less than men, because you're not God. So the only antidote is this embodiment, and what Tocqueville saw when he came to America was not these virtuous citizens. He says they have that habit of forming based on association. So they have the habit of building embodied communities, and the problem was that we see this sense of embodiment disappearing more and more, and not by accident, you would say, those mental illnesses for the roof. You see, we're never going to have a perfect life, but the best we can have is embodied community where we accept our families and our friends' voice. Say, yeah, I love them anyway. That's the best you can get. And if you set up the fugitive exact words, the fugitive perfection, the fugitive standard of perfection as the alternative to that, you say, well, this is imperfect because my family has these words, my local community has these words, it has this history. You do that, you are destined to oscillate back and forth to have this problem. You are destined to have. There's nothing you can take all the drugs in the world, it will not help you. Because human beings are embodied creatures, and you must remember that. But what was unleashed with the French Revolution was this idea of universal humanity. So that's his problem as a whole. And he's not sure, I'm just going to do this. If you read volume 2, he's not sure we're going to make it. And I'm not sure we're going to make it. I think Patrick will say next week, when he talks about Tocqueville, we can't make it under the current set of suppositions. But we have to understand that we are embodied creatures, whether we love. So the pathology of our times is selfie man. It's not by accident to me that identity politics corresponds with globalism. Globalism, everybody talks about globalism and cosmopolitanism. Say, that's just terrible. We need to have bigger. But Tocqueville saw, it's in volume 2, part 1, chapters 2 and 3. Tocqueville saw that the very structure of human experience become life. We could, on one hand, utterly collapse into ourselves and think only in terms of universes. Not engage in our neighbors in real time. No, selfie man and management society and global. Those are the two nodal points where we live. We literally dwell there. Tocqueville said the antidote to that is not a philosophical teaching. The antidote to that is us realizing that produces these incredible highs and lows, incredible highs and lows. And only when you can look at these things and see that they go together, the high of being selfie man and the low of feeling utterly impotent, only then do you say, I will choose a third alternative, which is neither. I will choose embodied life with my neighbors. I will get off Instagram and social media. It's killing you. It is killing you. I will get off my morphine and heroin addiction. That's what it is. And I will live in a face-to-face way. That's what Tocqueville saying. And so you can say I'm a conservative or I'm a left. It doesn't matter. It's our habits of thinking. It's a problem. That's what I'm writing about in the book called The Gentle Seduction of Tyranny. This is not a left right. This is the habits that we are likely to form in the democratic age and what we must fight if we're serious about it.
So in terms of looking at identity politics, you said that there's kind of like a gain to looking for stain and then removing it. Is that the same thing as looking for purity and preserving it, or are those two ideas incompatible?
So identity politics, I mentioned it's an incomplete. So let's talk about the respects in which it is Christian. Respects in if you take the Christian doctrines, originally seriously, and everything I'll call them identitarians are trying to do, which is to search throughout history to find ever deeper ways in which you are guilty without even knowing it. That is the claim about religion, right? It's always already there. And so when I say to identity politics defenders, I say, you're feasting on the crumbs of Christianity. You call me a racist or guilty of microaggressions or unconscious bias, to which I say, well, that's a Christian claim of urgency, except it's a really watered down, weak version. So I oppose it by showing that it's only a part manifestation of something else. So what it gets right is the irredeemable state. Guilty. The piece that it rules out is is the grace, is the reconciliation, is the forgiveness, right? So that's why I said our churches are strange, because our churches are all about the God of love, and identity politics is all about indictment and stain. Right, so we've taken half of it out, and that's the Roman politics. And I didn't say this words here, but let me just make a distinction between Christianity and identity politics to be really clear. So I want to say something about what the Christian understanding is. So with Christianity, you and I have a stain we cannot always. And by the way, this is worked out before Augustine in Saint Athanasius' great little book called The Divine Incarnation. It's about 100 pages long. Basically saved the Christian Church because it was the basis then of Nicene Creed. But Athanasius says there was a divine dilemma. Divine dilemma was man had so turned away from God. No amount of good works, there's no amount of virtue seeking, there's no amount of pain, but could not. And that's why God had to break in. I'm trying to be theological about this, but I have to lay this out so that you can see what's going on. So there had to be a divine breaking in. There had to be one innocent victim who took away the sins of the world, not once, but for all time. So there's this vertical understanding, get this straight, vertical understanding in Christianity. Innocent victim, every human being is guilty. There are no innocent groups and stained groups. Every human being is stained. Every human. And so with Christianity, there's a vertical understanding of this relationship between scapegoat, innocent victim, and irredeemable state. That's a vertical understanding. What identity politics does is it turns it. It says there are innocent victim groups and irredeemably stained groups. And in order to purify the world, the toxin, and these medical analogies are not without merit, toxic masculinity. These things the toxins have to be the dirty fossil fuels, the toxic masculinity. These are all medicinal, religious understandings. You have to get this straight. And so the idea is we human beings can purify the world by doing an accounting. And this is what you're learning in college of who the pure ones are and who the innocent victims. That's that. Now, here's the problem. There's many problems. One is that with the Christian formulation, there is one sufficient victim who takes away the sins of the world for all time, once and for all. That's it. But if you made this imminence, right? That's transcendent formulation. If you make this imminence, then what happens is once you have purged one group, once you get rid of toxic masculinity, boys are off addicted to pornography and dying of fentanyl. Once you do that, once you get rid of them, you don't understand. The scheme requires a new scapegoat because it's an imminent scheme. And so the Karen meme is for me not an accident, but that's out there. I do think that Black men will sooner or later become the objects of this cathartic rage. Conservatives especially, who believe in the traditional family and the traditional church. This would be Martin Luther King. So the problem with identity politics is that once it makes this vertical relationship horizontal, then you have to keep going farther and farther out to find more and more guilty parties. And the corollary, you have to keep going farther and farther out to find innocent. And I don't want to be, moving too much of a delicate direction here, but the argument is, and now I want to talk about Black conservatives. Okay, the argument is civil rights goes to women's rights, goes to gay rights, goes to transgender rights. And I'm here to tell you that the Black conservatives that I talk with will say this: listen, we alone wore the crown of thorns because of slavery, and feminists, gays and lesbians, transgenders can raise the issues they want, but they cannot rest on the moral authority. But the argument is not only you have to keep finding scapegoats that are farther, but you have to find innocent victims that keep going farther and farther. And what I'm trying to think about is what's the social consequence of that? Because you're constantly looking for areas of stain where heretofore you thought it was purity. So once we thought the founding fathers were pure, and now, that will be. And my point is that every group, you might now, I tell this to my students, you might now, you're covered with the blood because you're a woman or black, okay? Right now, I'm here to tell you that this imminent scheme of scapegoating goes farther and farther, and you'll say, well, I'm innocent, but look at those horrible people who in the past did this. And I say to them, well, I notice you're drinking. It's a lot of 50 years from now, I can assure you, the biggest problem we're going to have is going to be microplastics in the ecosystem. And you are contributing to this. And while you might think you're pure now, just as they did, your whole life will be erased because you drank water out. This never ends. This is the problem. Infinite scheme of scapegoating. It never ends. Whereas on a Christian account, there's one scapegoat that takes away the sins of the world. This will allow you to understand the agony of Tocqueville writes. Christianity at the end of slavery, and Christianity introduced it, because if you've got a vertical schema of scapegoating and innocent victimhood, listen carefully. There's no way whatsoever that you can then look out into the world and find a group to scapegoat, because the scapegoating has been done in this vertical relationship. So the agony of Christianity was, here's this world-changing insight that you can no longer do what pagan civilizations have done for thousands of years, which is to purge the scapegoat, to salt the fields, to kill everyone. Right? And now the insight is that cathartic rage addressed toward another will not solve the problem, because it's always. And that's what begins just war theory, begins the civilization of Europe. And Christians introduce slavery, which is scapegoat. You see the agony. So I would say we're not yet Christian, because we still haven't taken that central insight. Yeah, I'm not trying to be a theologian. What I'm trying to tell you is we're living out a theological scheme, a halfway theological scheme that grasps the central question: is innocent victimhood, scapegoat, stain? Those are the three central categories, the Christian categories. But now makes the horizontal relationship. And that's why this is the greatest moment of a religious awakening since Jonathan. And no one's going to change. It doesn't matter. We're involved in this. Everybody trying to going to Whole Foods to get your food pure. The COVID mask thing. Oh no, my God, the poisons are out there. I'm just going to mask up everything. Look, I'm all for reasonable medical science, but it was more than that. It was, I'm going to get rid of stain. I'm going to be the pure one. We're all desperately looking for purity in ways to distance ourselves.
So you was a little confused. What do you mean to private disorders and human association problem?
Yeah, so I want to be careful what I say here. What I have noted in reading the history of thought, and this is one of many reasons you should read the history of thought, is that problems which in our day appear one way were well known for a very, very long time. And this understanding of human life is oscillate highs and lows, long-standing understanding. Augustine, it's there in the Confessions. I think it's there in the public. It's very quickly by, because what he sees in the tyrant, remember this, it's a battle between the philosopher and the tyrant. Who's the happiest? He says the tyrant is the one who oscillates back and forth, like mastery and other types. It's there in Augustine's Confessions. I think it's there in Augustine's picture. So has right. Melancholy is a friend of delight. Manic depression. Tocqueville sees this. People, citizens of the democratic themselves as greater than kings and less than man. He says madness would be the central problem. And we have, as our mediating, we have generation upon generation who are more, I'll use the term guilt. And because our medical profession thinks through problems in a certain way, they say, do this. And Tocqueville understands that the human condition has to be sure about this. However, we can do things, we can take pills that make us less diseased. We can do things that make us slightly more happy. He's not a perfectionist, but his view is the fundamental problem is loneliness and isolation and the huge oscillations that happen, which we now call medically we called it a generation ago manic depression, now we call it bipolar. I know there are other things as well. I want you to think about this question. Is there something happening? Do we all have some dim sense that this oscillation we're going through is probably not good for us? That the solutions that are offered, but in fact, the big problem of us that when we're ill, we're drawn to the things that poison us. Plato saw this very. And so you feel lonely and isolated, so what do we do? Self-humanity, we need more social. This becomes a social contagion. All the various social movements, which could only be understandable through Instagram and TikTok, which are doing way more harm to women than men. Way more harm. And what Tocqueville would say is, it's a long road back. It's like back. Because why? Because the first steps toward health, once you're addicted, don't feel healthy. That's the key. And so, on his view, what we have to do to not succumb to this greater than kings and less than men is to, at every moment we can, is to recognize highs and the lows go together. Really difficult things to take the thing that's not the high. The thing that's not the high is everyday relations. The careful, slow, never fully successful friendships, work, love. That's the way we live. And that's a longer story because these very institutions have just not equality. All the mediating institutions he talks about, they're necessary to save democracy from itself. Have this hierarchical relationship. You know this. Your friendship groups have certain hierarchies. Your family, you need to learn how to rule and lead. And then you can do equality. So his answer is we have to recognize, for our day, his answer is we have to recognize that we're living this crazy oscillated life back and forth. We need the mediating institutions. And now to come back to my point, it's not only that they're dying of atrophy, it's that identity politics identifies them as impure and so goes after them. That's a problem. And then the problem of digital substitutism. Substitute for, choose the really hard word. You can use social media and technology as a supplement, but not as a substitute. This is my general thesis, and I think it's the biggest problem around the world. It's what I call digital substitute. And we know the experiment. What is the experiment? We will render everything digital. And analog is the everyday life of friction. And what we've decided to do is in China too. In fact, China's leading the way, and stupid Americans are following the way. Digital is a supplement to analog, not a substitute for Instagram, Facebook. They are supplements to real friendship, not a substitute for it. And because we're looking for shortcuts, we're moving to the problem, we're falling into the trap of substitutionism. Digital substitution is the great hope. How many of you have a map in your car and can, if Google Map goes off, you can navigate? How many? Raise your hands. Raise them high. So the rest of you, in other words, when Google Maps goes down, you're stuck. You wouldn't know how to get to the store. We need to think about this. Right? We're moving towards digital substitutism. And we're deciding we don't need the competencies of map reading, of friendship, etc. This is the problem. And one more thing, focus on this. When citizens lose competence, then the state has to step in and say, I see you've lost competence. Now the state has to add more and more apparati to your life because you yourselves don't have competence.
I was gonna ask. No, I'm sure if I heard you correctly. Did you say that TikTok and and how, or did you say that TikTok is caused more harm?
No, I think I don't follow John Hay too closely, but from what I can tell, that statistical analysis podcast just recently, that once his argument is between 2011 and 2015, the minds of a whole generation. Because you had face first phone, the iPhone, you had large data contracts, and TikTok and Instagram, all these things get started. So that's where it begins. COVID makes the problem far worse. And for reasons that he never fully lays out, the statistics suggest that women are, men are too, but young girls especially, by Instagram and TikTok. Because the way I describe this to girls at Georgetown is this: I say, listen, if you're living in a small town and there's 20 girls among you, of the same age, you know, you might not be prettiest, most talented, pick your favorite descriptor, but you'll find your way. But if you're comparing yourself to 3.5 billion other women who are the influencers, to go back to your point, you know, women who have these perfect lives, perfect bodies, whatever that may be, you get really, really demoralized. Because the pool that you're comparing yourself to is the digital pool, not the analog pool. Okay? And so suicidal thoughts, depression, it's skyrocketing. It's gone up with men considerably, but it's on the order of 30%, women under 30, 12%. So it's not healthy. Tocqueville is asking is how can we be healthy and democratic? And to come back to the conservative theme, there are things worth conserving that we don't fully understand. If you use the standard of perfection and look at family, we all know your family's not good. And you love it. Learn to love it by loving. You have to love it, put into it, and then you come to appreciate it. And if you use the standard of perfection, which Tocqueville saw as the great threat, use the standard of perfection, everything that's even slightly imperfect, that's not good. And so you're going to be the romantic soul who hovers over the world and suffers from this manic high in love. So it's not good. And so I do think that Tocqueville has the best psychological assessment, what I call the democratic soul. It's just unmatched. And he saw it almost 200 years ago.
Let's take a break. And move into the seminar portion of our class. Before we do that, can we thank Professor Mitchell?
I'll be back.